Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Reading Culture. And today we are going to be shifting gears a little bit. We're going to be looking at a very different kind of text than the kind of text that we've been looking at hitherto. We're going to be looking at what is known as Faludy's Convocation Address, which is unsurprisingly a convocation address given by a fellow named Faludy. So George Faludy was a Jewish-Hungarian writer, poet, who was imprisoned in a concentration camp in communist Hungary in the 1950s. Later immigrated to Canada, and in the 1970s, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Toronto. And when he was awarded that degree, he gave a convocation speech, which we are going to read. Now, it may seem kind of like an odd choice, right? We're having a discussion here about the hero, and especially the hero of the function of the hero in culture. So why are we looking at a convocation address? Well, there are several reasons for this. One is, so we've moved out of the realm of myth, and we are soon going to be moving into you could think of as the more traditional realm of fiction, right? Short stories, plays, poems. But it's important to note that these patterns, right, the patterns that manifest themselves in literature and narrative with regards to the hero and heroism, they also are present in historical reality, in our experience of things. And so looking at nonfiction and seeing how nonfiction can also uh, display these kinds of patterns is important. But even that may not totally answer the question of why we are looking at this particular text. After all, what does this have to do with heroism, right? It's an intellectual who's imprisoned in a concentration camp. Well, there are some very important things to think about, I think, with regards to this text. Um, when we're having this discussion and this consideration of heroism, one is the victim as hero, right? Is victim and hero are these mutually exclusive categories? Can they be one and the same? And if so, how do we differentiate them? Right? Think about that. Think about Floodi's status in his story as a victim, but also how he could possibly be functioning in some kind of heroic way, potentially, and how what could set him apart too from the other victims that are also suffering in the concentration camp. Um, the other thing that's interesting about this text is thinking about the passive hero. So if heroism exists in the stories from the six worlds that we looked at, it's a very kind of active kind, right? Very much in that traditional kind of, you could think, ancient mode of the superpowered person. And as we go forward, we will be looking at many more traditional kinds of manifestations of the hero, right? The person who goes out and fights dragons and leads armies. But what about the passive hero? Right? Is that a contradiction in terms? Does it make sense that the hero could possibly be defined by what he doesn't do? These are all things that I would like you to keep in mind as we go through the text. But now I'm simply going to read it to you here. So again, this is uh, upon being awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Toronto. Uh, it was given on the 29th of November 1978, and it was first published in the University of Toronto Bulletin on the 18th of December 1978. For an exile who has spent the better part of his life taking refuge from the sadistic East in the masochistic West, it is an almost overwhelming honor to be recognized in this fashion. So note how he starts for a moment. There is this sense of he's positioning the argument, right, of this man of two worlds. He seems to be identifying particular faults that he sees in both. I have made my home in Canada for the past 11 years, and have found here, as nowhere else, the peace and security of a marvelously decent society. But of the many kindnesses shown me here, none has moved me more than this honorary degree from the University of Toronto. My happiness is the greater in that the tradition of humanistic learning is in this university far more alive than in many others. I must admit, as well, some trepidation in following in the footsteps of a former compatriot, the late Zoltan Koldai, who was also honored here some years ago. Also, besides the main point of our discussion, thinking about you know heroism and nonfiction and things like that, also think about how he's constructing his argument as well, how he's positioning himself in relation to his audience. This originally would have, of course, been delivered orally, and how this will affect how his argument comes across. If there was time, I would consider it my duty to speak on a subject which has long occupied my mind, as much as poetry itself, on the survival of humanistic learning in a world where affluence has joined hands with destruction, a world in which absolutist ethics has given way to relativistic, then to utilitarian, and finally to no ethics at all. A world in which education increasingly means vocational training, diffusion of facts and data, in which comfort has become the measure of a civilization, in which our greatest intellectual achievement, our science, has abjured the concept of wisdom, just as philosophy has come to renounce love. A world, in short, with one foot firmly on the foundation of an incredible advance in knowledge and technique, and the other foot dangling in a spiritual vacuum. But my purpose this evening is not to depress you with the fate of humanistic learning, but to tell you briefly how that learning on one occasion ensured the physical and spiritual survival of several hundred people, including myself. So note one of the things that he's doing argumentatively here is he is already indicating his telos, the point that he's trying, and it's really a demonstration, right? An illustration using narrative, using story. In other words, he's not going to try and convince people about the benefit of humanistic learning through straight argumentation. He's going to use narrative and he's going to use story. And that's one of the reasons that we can actually look at this and analyze this as a story as he begins to tell it. Some years ago in Hungary, I found myself, for the second time in my life, in a concentration camp. There were some 1,300 inmates, Democrats, Catholics, liberals, socialists, and people without any political preferences, most sentenced to hard labor on trumped-up charges, though a few were there without having been sentenced or even charged. We could neither write nor receive letters and parcels. We had no books, newspapers, radios, or visitors. We cut stones from dawn to dusk, 365 days a year, except for May Day. May Day being the main holiday in communist countries that celebrates the glories of socialism. We did this on a diet of 1,200 calories a day. Our situation was thus better than in a Nazi concentration camp, but much worse than in the present-day Soviet camps recently described by Bukowski and others. Right, so he's laying out the situation which has brought him here. Now, interestingly, he actually doesn't define specifically how he ended up there. Rather, it seems that the point is more the system itself, that it brings a whole swath of society together in one place and under horrible circumstances. At first, we returned to the barracks at night, deadly tired, with no strength even to pull off our army boots and fall asleep on the rotten straw sacks. Our lives seemed not to differ from those of the slaves that built the pyramids, and our futures seemed equally bleak. But already on the day of my arrest, in the Black Maria that took me away, I had met young friends who had been denied a university education because of the war. Their faces had lit up. "You can lecture us in the camp," they said. "We'll get our university education that way." So imagine the situation, right? Particularly for us in the West, where often the ability to go to get a university education is taken for granted, and people often do it under duress or feel like they're forced to, or force themselves to do it. These people are in a very, very dire situation, and for them, it's a kind of gleaming light, right, that they're able to pursue. After about a week in the camp, two of them approached me and insisted that I start my lectures immediately after lights out. We were by then even more exhausted than on the days of our arrival. At first, 4 men sat beside my pallet. We were jeered at by others. Eventually, 12 prisoners gathered beside my straw sack every night for an hour or two. We recited poems, Hungarian poems and foreign poems in translation. Among the English ones, the Ode to the West Wind became the favorite. Then I would speak on literature, history, or philosophy, and my lecture would be discussed by all. So again, note these subjects, right? Literature, history, philosophy, right? These are not utilitarian things. He's not teaching them about how, they could escape the camp or something like that. I was by no means the only prisoner to deliver such lectures. A former member of the short-lived democratic government knew Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream by heart, and recited both to an enthusiastic audience. There were lectures on Roman law, on the history of the Crusades, narrations of large parts of war and peace, courses in mathematics and astronomy, avidly listened to, sometimes by men who had never entered a secondary school. There was even a former staff colonel who whistled entire operas. Those of us who lectured ransacked our memories to keep alive a civilization from which we were hopelessly, and it seemed, permanently cut off. So note again the importance of this part of the narrative, and and juxtapose this sense of kind of longing for what has been lost. And it's interesting, particularly, right? Many people, of course, are forced to study Hamlet, right, much to their displeasure. But these people yearned for it. Many may also sympathize with this feeling of feeling cut off, often through a deliberate ideological shift in our pedagogical values. The common inheritance that used to be really everyone's uh, civilization and tradition in the West has really been, in many cases, deliberately severed. People may feel that even if they want it, they're hopelessly cut off from it. But it couldn't possibly be worse than this situation in which they find themselves here in the story. There were prisoners who looked on all this with disgust, maintaining that we were insane to spend our sleeping time in lectures when we were all going to die anyway. These men, intent on survival, retreated into themselves, becoming lonely, merciless with others, shutting out thought and even speech. Note this connection between this separation from people and from learning, right? It leads to an actual degradation of your ability to think and to speak. And indeed, keep in mind, again, the rhetorical nature of this speech, right? One, that he would be delivering it, but also how he is laying out a specific way to kind of conceive of the world. By the second winter of our imprisonment, it began to happen when we were working that once, twice, or even 3 times in the course of a day, a prisoner would suddenly stop work and stagger off through the deep snow. After 20 or 30 yards of running, he would collapse. In each case, the man would die a day or two later, usually without regaining consciousness. Those who died in this way were always the men who had been most determined to survive, those who had concentrated on nothing but food, sleep, and warmth. For my part, owing perhaps to large doses of pragmatism and positivism in my youth, I was reluctant to admit the obvious, that delighting in a good poem or discussing Plato's Socratic dialogues could somehow arm the spirit to the point that it could prevent the body's collapse. So we're presented with a seeming paradox that those who focus on those things which surely one needs to survive, food, sleep, and warmth, they're the ones that are dying. And the ones that are sacrificing their own sleep in order to receive this intellectual content is actually somehow helping them to survive. And he's presenting here a premise, right? A very shocking premise, perhaps, to some. That is it possible that a poem or reading Plato could actually somehow not just help the mind, but also the body? But then I was presented with proof. While I was washing myself in the snow before the barracks one evening, one of my pupils, a former government official, a strong young man, came up to tell me that he would not attend the lecture that night, nor indeed any other night. He wanted to survive, was going to sleep rather than talk. He was going, he said, to live the life of a tree or a vegetable. He waited before me as if expecting my objection. I was indescribably tired, and closing my eyes I saw scenes from my childhood, the sort of hallucinations one has in a state of semi-starvation. Suddenly it occurred to me that I must dissuade the man. But he was already gone. He slept perhaps 20 yards from me, but I never summoned the strength to argue with him. 5 days later, we saw him stop work, begin to run towards the trees, and then collapse in the snow. His death has been on my conscience ever since. But without exception, all those who lectured and all those who listened survived. This is a very important part of the narrative because we're presented now with a very emotional story, someone he knew particularly and whom he saw die, having given up this intellectual life. And we see him express guilt that he was unable to save him, or perhaps wasn't able to muster up the strength to save him. And note this again, if we're considering, is Faludy a hero in the narrative? And I don't even mean according to himself, even though he's telling us. I mean analyzing it as a text, as a story. Is he the hero? Is he a hero? He doesn't save this man in this case. It does not seem to me to be so far-fetched to apply this lesson in the infinitely more pleasant society of this country. It justifies, I think, the Platonic view that man, as given by nature, owes it to himself to obey the dictates of his higher nature, to rise above evil and mindlessness. Those in the camp who attempted this survived, although physical survival had not been their aim. And those who, for the sake of physical survival, vegetated, perished in large numbers. It seems to me that the mentality of these latter is mutatis mutandis, that is, with the things being changed that need to be changed, analogous to the mentality of the consumer societies of the world, of those who seem obsessed with producing and consuming an ever-growing mountain of things to ensure comfort and survival, who have addicted themselves to energy as if to morphine until they are ready to destroy all nature to increase the dosage, who have indeed increased our lifespan, but have failed to mention that the brain requires jogging even more than the heart if that lifespan is to mean anything. So again, note this sense of meaning, rising above circumstance, as being one of the main things that he's trying to draw out of this tale. Now that he's finished the main part of the story, is wrapping up rhetorically to really emphasize the main purpose of his argument. The other conclusion I have drawn from my camp experience, and have tried to embody in my own poetry, is that our whole fragile tradition of art and thought is neither an amusement nor a yoke. For those who steep themselves in it, it provides both a guide and a goal, far surpassing all the half-baked ideologies that have blown up at our feet in this century like landmines. Sitting comfortably in the present and looking forward to longevity in an unknown future does nothing to ensure our survival, nor even to make it desirable. In any case, we do not live in the future. We live in the present. And all we have to guide us in this present is the accumulated thought and experience of those who have lived before us. Note this point. So we just finished in the previous videos looking at a series of myths, right, handed down orally over time. And the idea is that they present something real and true and good in them, or they wouldn't have been preserved for ages unknown. So that's what he's saying here. He's saying that the vast corpus of wisdom that we get, right, whether it be in philosophy or literature or philosophy, right, these actually help us to live. And so in that sense, again, we can conceive of what he's doing as possibly having less of a function in the kind of material heroic sense, but perhaps what he's doing is actually helping people in a more elevated way. In other words, he's a kind of preserver of lost things. For all the deficiency of my own learning, then, this is what I've attempted to voice in my work. And at this point in my life, I feel safe in echoing the words of Petronius. Per vixi neque enim fortuna malignor umcam ripiet nobis quod prio horror dedi. I have lived, and no evil fate can ever take away from us what the past has given. I believe we will do ourselves a favor if we extend the meaning of the author of the Satyricon to include the past of all humanity. I should give my thanks for the exceptional honor bestowed upon me this evening by our great university, and to all of you for your patience. Thank you. He ends his speech, which really extending the lesson to all of humanity, right? There's this sense that there's a common past, right, that can help us all into the future. So if this is the way he frames the argument, and again, note how he frames it, right? We have pathos, we have the emotional, right, story of this person who's seen die. We have ethos, we have this kind of ethical position of setting itself up as a preserver of something worth preserving against a society that is trying to destroy it. And we have the logos, right, the main argumentation, presenting the thesis, the value of a humanistic education is actually intrinsically a part of the human person, and presenting it with evidence. And again, we have that story within the convocation address, right? A story within this overall speech where he is the main character. So what kind of a character is he? Is he only a victim in a field of victims? Does he stand out? Is there something heroic about his actions? He cannot save the young man from walking off into meaninglessness. But he does, it seems, at least try to preserve meaning insofar as he can. And perhaps that is heroic in and of itself.